Evan stepped onto sky-high flight 672 with the quiet confidence of a 17-year-old who had learned early on that blending in was the safest choice. He was dressed in a charcoal hoodie, crisp dark jeans, and clean white sneakers, clothes he'd saved up for by working weekends at his aunt's diner. Around his neck swung a pair of sleek over-ear headphones that had been a graduation gift, and in his hand he held a slim black smartphone that doubled as his lifeline. He scanned the cabin, found seat 2A with its generous window view and plush 32-inch wide leather armchairs, and settled in, careful to place his soft backpack gently in the overhead bin so he wouldn't disturb anyone. To him, this wasn't just first class. It was a small reward after months of juggling math tests and late shifts at the diner. He wasn't here to show off. He just wanted a quiet flight. Bridget, the senior flight attendant in her late 40s, moved down the aisle with crisp staccato footsteps that echoed off the polished overhead bins. She was roughly 5 feet 6 inches tall, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform unblemished. Passengers in rows 4 through 8 received a bright smile and a warm welcome aboard, but when she spotted Evan, her practiced cheer vanished. Bridget's lips thinned into a line as she paused beside him, folded her arms with a slow exhale, and tilted her head in that way meant to remind a student of a teacher who held all the power. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough that the woman across the aisle looked up from her tablet. "Are you sure you belong here?" Evan looked up, confused. He unzipped his hoodie pocket and held out his boarding pass. Bridget snatched it, scanning the barcode as if it were a forgery. Her eyes darted from the paper to his face and back again, narrowing with each flick. "This is a first-class ticket," he said calmly. She didn't smile. "And you're traveling alone in first class?" "No one in economy whispers to their family about how hard it was to get here," she sneered under her breath. He didn't respond. He'd been taught that drawing attention never ended well. Bridget's jaw clenched, and her voice sharpened. There's been a mistake. You need to move to the back." When Evan stayed seated, she reached out and grabbed his phone resting on the armrest, yanked it toward her, and slapped his hand so hard that the crack echoed through the cabin louder than the call for final boarding. The sound stunned every passenger. A young mother clutching a teacup gasped, her eyes filling with horror. A businessman glanced up from his newspaper, shifted uncomfortably, then looked away as if afraid to acknowledge what he'd seen. Yet no one spoke, no one intervened. Bridget's smirk was proud and cold, as though she'd just proven a point. He stared at her for a heartbeat, pain flaring in his palm, but his voice stayed calm. "I am a first-class passenger." She rolled her eyes and folded her arms again. "Well then, show me how you got this seat." Silence pressed in on Evan as he rose and pulled his hoodie hood forward. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply gathered his belongings and walked down the aisle, each step heavy with the weight of embarrassment and fury. He found a cracked, mustard-yellow seat in the very last row, the one with a broken armrest and no legroom to speak of, and sat down. The cushion was worn, the tray table creaked, and he knew that for the next few hours he'd be jostled by every bump on the runway, but none of that mattered. What mattered was what he did next. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling just enough to betray the calm he tried to show. With a single, deliberate text, "She slapped my hand and kicked me out," he messaged home. Then he tapped send and leaned back, fixing his gaze on the dirty plastic window as the tarmac lights blurred past. Outside, nothing seemed different. The runway stretched for miles in the dusk, waiting for wheels to roll. Inside, everything had changed. He closed his eyes and let out a steadying breath. He wasn't done. Miles away, in a sleek office tower downtown, William Walker raised a hand to quiet the hum of assistants in his corner office. He was broad-shouldered with peppered hair above a sharp navy suit that looked custom-made. When his phone buzzed, he read his son's message without flashing an eyelash. He didn't stand. He didn't curse. He simply set the phone down and picked up his desk receiver. "Flight operations," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. I want eyes on Flight 672, Section C2MA. Report an incident immediately. Yes, sir." He hung up, leaned back, and let the storm gather behind his cool gaze. Back on the plane, Bridget retreated to the galley, her usual swagger replaced by a tight, self-satisfied grin. She poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee, took a long sip, and leaned against the stainless counter. "That kid was a troublemaker, plain and simple," she muttered to Taylor, the younger attendant with the soft voice and the sympathetic eyes. "There's no place for freeloaders in first class." Taylor hesitated, but his ticket was real. She shrugged. "People borrow boarding passes all the time. We can't have that here." A soft chime crackled through the cabin. Bridget's heart skipped. She straightened, wiped her hand on her skirt, and nodded at Taylor. Probably just a routine call. She forced a laugh and flipped her hair, but when she set her cup down and stepped toward the cockpit, she felt a twist in her chest. Passengers were staring now, whispering behind gloved hands. The tension in first class had shifted. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. When Bridget pushed open the cockpit door, Captain Reese Hammond stood waiting. He was salt and pepper with 30 years of service and the unruffled confidence of someone who'd flown through every storm imaginable. He didn't smile, he simply pointed to the closed door. Bridget obeyed, latching it behind her with a click that sounded louder than any command. Behind the thick glass, on a small monitor, flickered the face of Richard Lane, Director of Flight Operations, a man whose voice cut sharper than any wind shear. "Bridget," he said, "your actions in first class were out of procedure. Did you verify the manifest?" She swallowed. I didn't have time." Captain Hammond's eyes met hers through the glass. "You assumed, and you failed to recognize who that passenger was." Bridget's knees threatened to buckle. The cabin felt miles away now, as though she'd stepped off the plane into a freezing rain. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," but it came out as a whisper. On the screen, Lane's lips tightened. That 17-year-old was Evan Walker, son of William Walker. Bridget's face drained of color. She had humiliated the wrong person. And before the engines even roared to life, she knew her world had tilted on its axis, and there was no turning back. Bridget's legs felt like lead as she clutched the in-flight phone, her fingers trembling over the keypad. The cockpit's order had reverberated in her mind. "You will personally apologize to Mr. Walker in front of all passengers, and you will escort him back to his original seat." Every syllable had sliced through her pride like a sharpened blade. 10 years in the skies, 10 years of enforcing protocol and policing passengers, all undone by a single misjudgment, a single moment when she had looked. A look that said, "You don't belong," and slapped the hand of a teenager who simply had the right to be there. She swiped her gaze across the cabin, past the rows of curious faces, past the hush that had settled like a fog. No one applauded, no one hissed. They watched, wide-eyed and uncertain, as Bridget swallowed and lifted her head. She adjusted her uniform jacket, trying to smooth the wrinkles that weren't there, and took a step back into first class. Evan sat in the last row of economy, headphones draped around his neck like battle scars. His hood fell back naturally, revealing eyes that had seen more injustice than most adults ever would. He didn't look at Bridget as she approached. He just sat still, hands folded over his phone, as though she were part of the background. But inside, his chest tightened. He could feel the eyes of every passenger, could hear the soft murmur of whispers. "That's the kid. That's the one she slapped. That's the one they ignored." He closed his eyes and took a steadying breath, willing his heart to slow. Bridget stopped a few feet away, the aisle stretching between them like a chasm. Her voice came out soft, hesitant, nothing like the clipped authority she'd wielded before. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice catching on the name, I want to apologize for the earlier incident. My actions were inappropriate." She paused, fingers twisting the edge of her skirt. "I misread the situation," she continued, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I assumed you didn't belong here, and I was wrong." Evan's eyes opened. He looked at her, calm and unblinking, as though he were weighing every syllable. "You misread me," he said, his voice steady. "You saw me and decided I didn't belong. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, just me." His words folded into the hush, and she flinched, as though struck by each one. Passengers craned their necks, leaning out of their seats for a better view. Some raised phones, ready to capture this public reckoning. Bridget felt tears prick her eyes. Tears of shame, tears of humiliation, tears for the years she'd spent believing her judgments were infallible. She wanted to say more, to beg forgiveness, to explain that she'd only been doing her job, but the words stuck in her throat. I'm sorry," she whispered, and then, even softer, "If you would, allow me," she added. "I'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class." The last part sounded like a plea, an entreaty rather than an order. Evan stood, bag over one shoulder, and nodded once. Together they walked up the aisle, past rows of silent witnesses. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone who knew his worth, even when others tried to strip it away. When they reached seat 2A, Evan slipped into the plush leather chair as though it were a rightful throne. The aisle chair beside him sat empty, a silent testament to the cruelty he had endured. Bridget stood by, hands clasped, unsure what to say next. "If there's anything else you need," she mumbled, "please let me know." But her voice was brittle, as though the very act of speaking might shatter her. He didn't answer. He simply pulled out a book as if nothing had happened, turning back to the page he'd been on before the world had tilted on its axis. She watched him read, pages fluttering like the wings of a wounded bird. Then she turned and walked away, retreating to the galley where Taylor stood waiting, eyes wide with sympathy. Taylor reached out, hand on Bridget's arm. "Are you all right?" she asked in a gentle voice. Bridget didn't meet her eyes. "I handled it," she said finally, though her voice was hollow. Taylor said nothing, only offered a small nod. In that silence, the weight of consequence pressed down harder than any reprimand. Meanwhile, up in the cockpit, Captain Reese Hammond monitored the hold-on departure. His hand rested on the intercom phone, listening to ground operations confirm the delay. The engines sat silent, the cabin's hum stilled. Normally, first officers flew the pre-flight checks at this stage, but today even they hesitated, glancing anxiously at the forward cabin door. The captain's own voice, usually calm as a still lake, was taut as a damaged wire. The director of flight operations had been clear: no takeoff until this situation was fully resolved. And resolve it they must. Back in first class, Evan sat with his legs crossed, posture erect. Passengers who had at first pitied him now watched with a different curiosity, wondering what this boy could do with his power. A woman in the front row whispered to her husband, "Did you see the way she cowered?" A man 2 rows back shook his head, muttering to his neighbor, "I should have said something." The cabin's mood had shifted from solemn to charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Evan glanced around. He wasn't looking for sympathy, he was simply noting the change. Then his phone vibrated. He looked down and read the message. "Stay calm. More people are watching than you think. The plane will still fly, but only on my terms." His father's voice, transmitted through text, was firm but reassuring. Evan lifted his head, eyes meeting Bridget's briefly as she passed by on her way to fetch refreshments. Her shoulders were slumped, her face pale. He gave her a small nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. She had made it right in her own way. In the back rows, economy passengers whispered among themselves. "That boy's gotta be someone important," one said. "The crew wouldn't bend like that otherwise," another replied. "I saw her slam his hand. Never forget that sound." And their silence was louder now. A chorus of regret. Evan leaned forward, picked up his phone and typed, "She apologized in front of everyone, but she still doesn't get it." He hit send, then tucked the phone back into his pocket. He picked up his book again, flipping to the next chapter. The words on the page swam before his eyes, but they offered a refuge, a reminder that stories could carry you anywhere, even above the clouds. The hours slipped by like slow raindrops on the fuselage. Bridget retreated to the galley and paced in short, jittery steps. Her mind replayed every detail, the way Captain Hammond's eyes had locked on her, the cold precision of the director's voice on the monitor, Taylor's pitying gaze. She pressed her back against the stainless steel wall, closed her eyes, and let out a shuddering breath. 10 years she had denied upgrades, redirected passengers, refused entry, and now she'd been exposed. Her arrogance laid bare at 30,000 feet. In her pocket, her phone vibrated. A message from her manager. "We're reviewing your conduct. Expect a call on the ground." Her chest tightened. She wasn't just going to face a reprimand. She might lose this job. This career she had built since she was 21, moving up the ranks with fierce dedication. She let her head drop, willing herself not to cry. Meanwhile, in first class, Evan looked around the cabin. The soft blue seatlights hummed quietly, the overhead bins clicked shut, and the scent of pine-scented air freshener lingered. A flight attendant passed with warm towels, pausing to give him a respectful nod. 2 rows up, a family waved him over, offering him a refill of sparkling water. It was surreal. Just minutes ago, he had been invisible, unwanted, humiliated. Now people were seeking his approval, eager to show kindness. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a gesture of gentle acceptance. He took the towel and dabbed at his forehead. He closed his eyes and let the crisp linen brush his skin, a small comfort after the storm. Down in economy, a mother of 3 pressed her daughter's hand. "See, honey? Always stand up for yourself, even if it feels scary." In the seat beside her, the girl nodded, eyes bright with understanding. Bridget would never know their names, but her actions had given them a lesson in dignity and respect. The intercom crackled overhead. Captain Hammond's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We apologize for the delay. Flight operations has placed an executive hold on our departure, but we expect to be underway shortly. Thank you for your patience. And to Mr. Walker, thank you for your understanding." The cabin filled with soft applause, not loud, but heartfelt. Evan closed his book and stood, offering a courteous bow of the head to the captain's voice. A flight attendant came to stand beside him and said in a low voice, "Sir, would you like a beverage?" He glanced at her, at the rows of seats behind, at the faces turned his way. "No, thank you," he replied. "Just water is fine." And then, "Please, no more apologies. I'm ready to fly." Bridget watched from the galley doorway, tears gleaming in her eyes. When the attendant returned without her, she stole a glance and saw Evan's serene profile. He didn't look victorious. He just looked free. Free from invisible chains, free from doubt imposed by others, free to be himself. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. He wasn't angry at her. He was above it. His real power wasn't his father's billions. It was his grace, his composure, his refusal to let cruelty define him. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off and the plane taxied toward the runway, Bridget gathered herself and stepped into first class. She stopped at Evan's door and said quietly, "Mr. Walker, I want to thank you. Your dignity reminded me of what this job is really about, serving people with respect." Evan looked up, surprised. His eyes searched hers for sincerity, and when he saw it, he nodded. "Thank you," he said. And then, after a beat, "Fly safe." She offered him a small smile, the kind that comes from the heart, and turned to return to the galley. As the jet engines roared to life, the cabin vibrated with potential energy. Passengers settled back, some exhaling long-held breaths. In that moment, everyone understood they had witnessed something rare, a public reckoning, a quiet triumph, and a lesson in humanity that soared higher than any airplane. For Evan, The flight was no longer just a trip from point A to point B. It was the moment he reclaimed his dignity, reminded the world of his worth, and set the tone for every mile he would travel henceforth. And Bridget, standing by the galley wall, pressed her hand to her heart. She had learned the hardest lesson of her career at 30,000 feet, that every passenger, no matter how unassuming, deserved respect. She straightened her shoulders and returned to work, determined to never again let arrogance cloud her judgment. The plane lifted off the runway, climbing toward the clouds, carrying with it the echoes of a story that would be told on every horizon. That respect is non-negotiable, and that, even in the face of cruelty, dignity can prevail. At the threshold, she paused. The curtain to first class sat open, revealing rows of plush leather seats and an audience of silent witnesses. She inhaled, steadying herself, and summoned every ounce of professionalism she had left. Then she stepped through. Passengers in the front row turned at the sound of her approaching. A few shifted awkwardly, clutching phone cameras with trembling fingers. They had watched the earlier confrontation in economy, the slap, the humiliation, the icy silence that followed. Now they saw the attendant who had delivered that blow, moving through their midst like a fallen monarch. Bridget forced her spine straight and met their gazes without flinching. She could feel the weight of their expectations. Some hoped for an apology, others for a spectacle. But she had already apologized once. What they needed to see now was accountability. She reached the aisle and saw him, Evan, sitting in seat 2A, the same window seat she had tried to displace him from. His posture was calm, dignified, and his eyes met hers without animosity. In that moment she realized that his power did not come from wealth or lineage. It came from grace under fire. He had endured her worst, responded with quiet strength, and now sat waiting, unbowed. She drew in a shaky breath and spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. "Excuse me, Mr. Walker," she said, choosing the name he had revealed in that forced apology. "You have every right to be in that seat. I have been instructed to escort you back so we can resume our flight." Then, like a rehearsed script, she added, "Thank you for your patience. Please follow me." It was more formal than the heartfelt apology she had offered in economy, but it marked the beginning of her penance. Evan rose and followed her up the aisle, each step a reminder of the humiliation he'd endured. Passengers watched in near silence, the tension in the cabin palpable. Some mouths hung open, some whispered regrets for their earlier indifference. Some raised their phones again, as though they could capture the moment justice was served. When they reached first class, Evan slipped back into 2A as if reclaiming a birthright. The seat enveloped him like a throne. Bridget stood beside him, hands clasped in front of her, unsure whether to remain or retreat. She offered him a nod, and then, after what felt like hours, slid out of sight, exiting through the galley into the jet bridge. As the door hissed closed behind her, the cabin exhaled. In the sudden hush that followed, a middle-aged woman in a wool blazer leaned over to her husband and whispered, "He had every right." And the man nodded, his expression both remorseful and impressed. "He should have spoken up when he saw that slap," he murmured. His wife squeezed his hand, eyes bright. In seat 2A, Evan sat with back straight and head high. He reached for his book but paused, letting his gaze drift across the cabin. He saw heads turned, a quiet acknowledgement in dozens of eyes. None of them had come to his aid. Instead, they had watched. But now they were watching differently, not as spectators to someone else's drama, but as witnesses to a man's dignity in the face of cruelty. His phone vibrated. A message from his father. "The doors have closed. We're cleared for takeoff." He typed back, "Thank you." Then he set the phone aside and opened his book. The words on the page seemed inconsequential now. The real story had just been written in the hushed rows of first class. Back in the jet bridge, Bridget signed the removal paperwork with heavy strokes, each letter a farewell to her career. She felt both relieved and shattered. She had always defined herself by her authority, her keen eye for protocol. Now that identity lay in tatters, A uniform so spotlighted now felt like an ill-fitting shroud. A stern-looking official in a crisp suit approached. Ms. Taylor escorted Ms. Monroe to the terminal lounge until security arrived, he said, offering her a curt nod. Bridget raised her chin and followed. With each step, she shed the weight of the badge she'd worn for a decade. Her world had contracted to a single moment, a single misjudgment, replayed on video screens and whispered about by strangers. Inside the cabin, the lights brightened as the crew prepared for departure anew. Eddie, the new lead attendant, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Taylor slipped back to her usual station, casting a glance at seat 2A. Evan had returned to his silent watch, but she caught the corner of his eye and offered him a small, respectful nod. He returned it, a connection unspoken but profound. Down, in economy, a young father showed his daughter the spot by the curtain. She remembered seeing the attendant cry as she left, he told her. "That's where courage met its match," she said. He smiled, ruffling her hair. The engines rumbled to life, the cabin vibrated with possibility. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the overhead announcement crackled through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize again for the delay. Flight 672 is now cleared for takeoff. We thank you for your patience and understanding." Then the gentle climb, the swoosh of air, and the plane lifted off. Evan watched the runway disappear beneath a blanket of cloud. He felt a calm thrill as the world stretched out below. He had not raised his voice, had not struck back in anger, had not demanded his rights with force. He had claimed them with dignity, letting those who would have judged him learn their lesson. His revenge had been quiet but shattering. The plane itself had been held hostage until justice prevailed. In the cabin behind him, passengers settled back into their seats, many exchanging glances that spoke of shared understanding. Some reached for their phones to check social media. The footage was already trending. News alerts popped up. Teen son of airline owner halts flight after alleged racial profiling. Headlines praised his composure, condemned the attendant's actions, and heralded a new chapter in conversations about privilege and prejudice. Evan closed his book and laid it on the tray table. He leaned back, hands folded across his chest, watching the soft glow of the reading lamp. He felt neither triumph nor bitterness. He felt relief and resolution. He had faced discrimination, endured humiliation, and witnessed the silence of strangers, and he had found a way to make them all see that respect is non-negotiable, that silence can be complicity, and that sometimes the most powerful act of retaliation is to demand accountability without raising a fist. He closed his eyes and allowed the hum of the engine to lull him. Behind him, the cabin lights shifted to dim mode, casting a calm ambiance over both first class and economy. The plane soared higher, carrying with it the echoes of what had transpired. On every horizon, it would be retold. The day a quiet teenager in a hoodie reminded the world of dignity and justice, and the attendant who learned too late that no uniform could shield her from the consequences of cruelty. And high above the clouds, Evan sat still, poised between two worlds, the one he had left behind on the tarmac and the one waiting for him on the ground below, knowing that sometimes the quietest voice carries the heaviest weight. Evan stepped into the terminal lobby and paused, letting the rush of people swirl around him like a tide. It was late morning, and the sunlight filtered through the soaring glass walls, painting the polished floor with golden patterns. He could hear the distant hum of baggage carousels, the soft chatter of travelers, and the occasional beep of a terminal alert, but in his ears echoed something else, the quiet strength he'd summoned up on the plane, the memory of every eye that had watched him, first with suspicion, then with admiration, then with respect. His father fell into step beside him, arm around his shoulder. William Walker was the same steady presence Evan had known all his life, the man who balanced kindness with authority, whose calm voice could still a room. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Evan nodded, though a swirl of exhaustion and pride weighed in his chest. "I'm fine," he said, "just thinking." William squeezed his shoulder and nodded. "Let's go grab coffee. I want to hear how you felt up there." They found a quiet cafe near the terminal's edge, its small tables dotted with travelers on layovers. Over 2 steaming mugs of black coffee, American style, no sugar. Evan described the moment Bridget slapped his hand. He talked about the itch of humiliation, the tightness in his throat when he rose and walked to the back, the cruel hush that fell over everyone. He told his father about the slow crawl of passengers' realization, the way their silence had felt like a wall, and then the swell of noise when news spread through the cockpit that the flight was on executive hold. William listened without interrupting, savoring his coffee in thoughtful sips. When Evan paused, he said, "You turned a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for change. That takes courage." Evan shrugged. "I just did what I had to." His voice cracked on the last words, and William reached across the table to rest his hand on Evan's. "You did more than that. You reminded people what dignity looks like." They rode back to the Walker residence in a quiet SUV, the city skyline passing in the rearview mirror. By the time they walked through the front door, messages had already flooded in. Emails from community leaders, texts from school administrators, a stack of letters in the foyer from people who'd seen the video and wanted to share their own stories of discrimination, stories of boarding buses in certain neighborhoods and being forced to stand, of applying for jobs and never hearing back, of being stared at by neighbors when they pulled into their own driveways. Evan read a few aloud to his father. One from a woman who'd hidden her heritage for years, another from a man who'd been barred from a university dorm, a teenager who'd been bullied for his accent. As the afternoon light waned, Evan retreated to his room to sift through it all. He sat on the edge of his bed, arms draped over his knees, and felt a swell inside him, a mix of determination and weight. He realized this wasn't just about one flight. It was about a lifetime of assumptions, stereotypes, and moments when people failed to see others as human beings. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting a blog post, his fingers flying over the keys. "Today I learned that silence can be a prison, that assumptions can hurt deeper than a slap, and that change often begins when someone says, 'Enough.'" I never asked for an apology. I never asked for my seat back. But I did demand to be seen, and in doing so, I hope I helped others demand the same. He wrote for hours, stopping only when the house lights dimmed and the front hallway glowed softly. His father poked his head in at midnight, tray of ginger tea in hand. "Thought you might want something before bed." Evan smiled gratefully, took the tea, and read a bit of his post aloud. William nodded appreciatively. "This is powerful," he said. "We'll publish tomorrow." The next day brought a flurry of activity. Reporters camped outside the Walker home, friendly local news crews filming stand-ups, national outlets requesting interviews. But Evan chose to meet just one, a community access show hosted by a woman named Rosa Noon, who'd long advocated for social justice. On camera, under the warm glow of studio lights, Evan sat across from Rosa, answering questions about his experience. He spoke softly but firmly. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted fairness. But now I realize that sometimes one person standing up can give strength to many others. If my story prompts one passenger to speak up next time, or one airline to train its staff differently, then it's worth it." After the taping, Rosa hugged him. "You've already done more than most activists achieve in a decade," she said. Evan felt a rush of humility. "I just know what it's like to feel unseen. I couldn't let that pass." Meanwhile, Eagle Air's corporate offices were in upheaval. Karen Mitchell, the CEO, had formed an emergency task force that included PR executives, HR leaders, and diversity consultants. They drafted a public statement acknowledging the incident, apologizing to Evan, and pledging mandatory bias training, things they broadcast across social media and major news networks. Within 24 hours, the story had trended worldwide. Headlines ranged from "Teen's Dignity Halts Flight" to racial profiling in the skies, and commentary poured in from every corner. Former flight attendants sharing stories of their own regrets, passengers thanking Evan for inspiring them, experts debating the airline industry's culture. Back at school, teachers invited Evan to speak at an assembly. In the auditorium filled with juniors and seniors, he talked about respect, bystander courage, and the power of quiet defiance. He concluded, "It's not about being loud, it's about being true. If you see injustice, even if it's small, you owe it to yourself and to others to act. Because inaction is a choice to accept the wrong." Afterwards, students lined up to shake his hand, share their own experiences, and thank him. A shy boy with red hair said he'd been teased for his speech impediment. A girl with glasses admitted she'd hidden her cultural background to fit in. An athlete confessed he'd laughed when a new kid got called out. Evan listened, offered encouragement, and realized his single moment had given voice to dozens who'd been silent. While community momentum built, Bridget's journey took her to the airline's training center in Atlanta. There, over several weeks, she attended intensive workshops on unconscious bias, empathy, and customer service. She listened to instructors recount stories of discrimination and practiced role-playing exercises, serving passengers of varied backgrounds, learning to check her assumptions, and receiving feedback on tone and body language. She journaled each night, writing about the moment she'd slapped Evan's hand and the hollow ache that followed. She vowed never to let pride blind her again. When Bridget returned to the line of flight attendants, she found herself a mentor to new hires. At an orientation session, she stood before a group of fresh-faced trainees and shared her story without naming names. "I judged someone by their appearance," she told them, voice trembling. "I assumed they didn't belong, and I was wrong. That mistake cost me my career and my dignity. So I ask each of you, look twice, ask questions, and above all, remember that every passenger deserves to be seen." The room was silent for a heartbeat, then filled with nods. A handful of trainees came forward afterward, thanking her for her honesty and admitting their own blind spots. Meanwhile, the Walker Foundation for Respect and Dignity took shape under Evan's leadership. He recruited a small board, teachers, community leaders, a school counselor, and his father, and together they established scholarship criteria. Applicants must demonstrate resilience in the face of discrimination, leadership in their communities, and a commitment to fostering inclusion. The foundation also partnered with local nonprofits to host workshops on bystander intervention and cultural understanding. Within 6 months, they awarded 30 scholarships and hosted training for over 2,000 high school students. Eagle Air's internal metrics began to shift. Passenger surveys showed a 10% increase in feeling respected ratings among minority flyers. Complaints about crew behavior dropped noticeably. The airline's board praised the initiative as both morally right and good business. Karen Mitchell credited Evan's courage for sparking a transformation. At a company-wide virtual town hall, she said, "This incident exposed a blind spot in our culture. Thanks to Mr. Walker's example, we are now committed to making every flight a model of respect and inclusivity." Social media continued to buzz. A flight attendant in Seattle posted a video thanking Evan for the training materials her airline had adopted. A blogger in London wrote about her experience overcoming prejudice on public transit, attributing her courage to Evan's story. In Canada, a school principal invited Evan to speak to students via live stream. The ripple effect crossed borders, cultures, and languages. Back home, Evan found some of the attention overwhelming. He still kept his bedroom simple, a tidy desk with his laptop, a bookshelf with favorite novels and framed family photos. He realized he needed balance. So he set boundaries. No phone at the dinner table, weekends reserved for family, and scheduled quiet time each evening to read or sketch. This routine helped him process the whirlwind of events and keep his emotional well-being intact. In the crisp days of early winter, Evan and his father traveled to Washington, D.C., at the invitation of a bipartisan congressional caucus on civil rights. There, in a sunlit hearing room, Evan delivered testimony on the importance of confronting bias in public services and transportation. Lawmakers listened, some taking notes, others nodding in agreement. His words echoed what he'd said on the plane and expanded to policy recommendations. Mandatory bias training for airlines, a task force to review customer complaints, and a national campaign encouraging passengers to speak up. His testimony made headlines in Capitol Hill newspapers. A senator praised Evan as the voice of a generation unwilling to accept injustice. A congresswoman announced legislation inspired by his advocacy. Evan returned home, exhausted but exhilarated. He realized his single moment of defiance had grown into a movement. One evening, after the Foundation's annual gala, held at a refurbished warehouse-turned-community center, Evan took the stage to speak to donors, scholarship recipients, and airline representatives. The room glowed with lanterns and fairy lights. Tables were dotted with photos of smiling teenagers, many of whom had benefited from the scholarships. Evan cleared his throat and said, "What began as a painful moment has become a promise that every person will be seen, every voice will be heard, and every injustice, no matter how small, will be named and challenged." The crowd rose in a standing ovation, eyes bright with tears and hope. In the months that followed, the Walker Foundation expanded nationally, partnering with airlines in Europe, Asia, and Australia. Evan consulted with global leaders on implementing similar training and scholarship programs. His story became a case study in business schools and diversity seminars. Professors lauded how a single individual, armed with nothing but dignity and courage, could shift corporate culture and inspire systemic change. Meanwhile, Bridget's committee published a report recommending best practices: transparent ticket verification processes, clear channels for passengers to report bias, and celebrating crew members who exemplified empathy. The report was lauded industry-wide, and several airlines adopted its guidelines. Bridget herself was invited to present at an international aviation conference, where she spoke candidly about her mistake, her shame, and her commitment to change. She concluded, "My greatest regret is not having paused to see the person before me. But my greatest hope is that my journey reminds us all that it's never too late to learn empathy." As the year drew to a close, Evan reflected on how far he and everyone else had come. What had started as a single, humiliating moment in first class had blossomed into a movement spanning continents. Passengers who once felt silenced now shared stories. Airlines that once prided themselves on efficiency now measured success in respect. Flight attendants who once trusted assumptions now learned to see with open hearts. On New Year's Eve, in the quiet of his bedroom, Evan wrote in his journal, "Today I realize that respect cannot be scheduled, enforced, or faked. It must be chosen, moment by moment. Whether you're a teenager on a flight attendant serving coffee, or a CEO drafting policy, every action matters." Our world shifts, not just with grand gestures, but with everyday kindness that refuses to stay silent. He closed the journal and looked out the window at the fireworks lighting the sky over the city. A smile touched his lips. He had reclaimed his dignity, sparked change, and reminded the world of a simple truth: respect is non-negotiable. And because he refused to stay silent, countless others found their voices. For an American woman of 65, this story may echo personal memories. Boarding school buses in the 60s, entering workplaces where she felt out of place, standing silent as others judged. It reminds her that dignity belongs to every person at every age. It teaches that courage isn't always loud, it can be a quiet insistence on fairness. And it shows that revenge need not be cruel. Sometimes it's simply ensuring the wrong is made right. So the next time you step onto a plane, walk into a store, or enter any space that feels unfamiliar, carry Evan Walker's lesson with you. Be seen, be heard, and if you witness injustice, speak up. Because silence can be consent, and every person deserves the chance to sit in peace, wrapped in the unbreakable cloak of respect. Evan leaned back into his seat as the cabin lights dimmed to the soft glow that signals relaxation mode. The engines hummed steadily and the plane rose smoothly through the sky. From the outside, this looked like any other flight climbing toward 35,000 feet. But inside these polished metal walls, something profound was still unfolding. Something that began with a single assumption and a cruel slap, and that had rippled outward into a quiet but unstoppable reckoning. News travels fast at 35,000 feet, even without Wi-Fi. A few rows behind him in economy, a middle-aged woman thumbed open her phone and saw a video clip already trending on Twitter. The moment Bridget Monroe had confronted Evan, snatched his ticket, and slapped his hand. The woman's feed was full of comments, some mocking Bridget's arrogance, others marveling at the chaos she had unleashed. One tweet declared that people like her lose power only when they think no one is watching. Another observed, "That video carries more weight than any shout." Everyone saw how cold the silence had been when Evan walked back to the back of the plane. Taylor, the younger flight attendant who had offered him water earlier, returned again with a fresh cart of drinks. She paused at his row, lingering longer than required by duty. Her voice was hushed as she placed a cup of sparkling water onto the tray table. "Sorry," she said softly. "I should have spoken up sooner." Evan looked at her, calm but firm. "You didn't have to fix it. You just had to see it." Taylor's eyes glistened. "I saw it," she whispered. "People don't usually get called out for something like that. They hide behind uniforms and rules and rank. You didn't let her get away with it." Evan nodded once, acknowledging both her apology and her newfound courage. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer, the one who had shifted uncomfortably during the slap, leaned forward and quietly said, "Look, I keep thinking about what happened, about how I just sat there." Evan did not open his eyes. He waited until the man found his words. "I think it's easier for people like me to pretend we didn't see it. But the truth is we did. I did." The man's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry," he said, voice tight. Evan finally looked at him. "That's brave, but it's not enough. Sometimes apologies come too late." He paused. "No, they come when you're willing to change." The man swallowed hard, shame and recognition mingling in his gaze. In the galley, Taylor checked her crew tablet and saw the first directive come through. All cabin crew are reminded to review anti-discrimination policy, mandatory training sessions scheduled next week. All incidents involving cabin conduct to be logged and reported immediately. A private note blinked at the bottom. "Keep an eye on first class." She pressed a finger to her lips and exhaled. Nothing was escalating, yet everything was shifting under her feet. The balance of power in this cabin had tilted irrevocably. The remainder of the flight passed in a kind of reverent hush. Flight attendants moved with extra care, as though walking on eggshells. Passengers nursed their beverages, but few spoke above a whisper. The usual chatter about connecting flights and meal choices had been replaced by a muted reflection on what they had all just seen. Eventually, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the extended delay. Flight 672 is now cleared for landing. Thank you for your patience." The clap of seatbelt buckles echoed through the cabin as people prepared for descent. Even that routine sound carried weight now, as if each click of plastic was a reminder of the controls that had been wrested from someone who thought they held them. Evan unbuckled his belt and stood, pulling his bag from the overhead bin. He gave Taylor a small nod when she caught his eye. She offered a tentative smile. When he passed the spot where Bridget had once glared down at him, he imagined her standing there now, maybe in an interview room, forced to confront her bias. Maybe she would learn something. Maybe her arrogance would soften. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires kissing the runway with a calm thud. Doors opened, and a security officer stepped aboard for Bridget. He waited silently by the curtain, clipboard in hand. No announcement was made. The hush was enough. As Bridget stepped into the jet bridge, her head bowed, Evan watched from first class. She passed without meeting his gaze. He turned and walked forward toward the aircraft door. Outside, bright terminal lights greeted him. His father was at the bottom of the jet bridge, arms spread wide. When Evan emerged into the light, William Walker said simply, "Welcome home, son." They walked together down the corridor, side by side, drawing the gaze of onlookers who whispered, "That's him, the quiet kid who changed everything." Later that day, Eagle Air released its official statement. The CEO, Karen Mitchell, spoke on camera. "We deeply regret the incident on Flight 672 and apologize to Mr. Walker and our passengers. We are conducting a full investigation, implementing mandatory bias awareness training for all staff, and reviewing our policies to ensure dignity and respect for every traveler. We will not allow this to happen again." The words played on screens worldwide. Comments poured in. Finally, an airline taking responsibility. It was a moment of corporate accountability spurred by a teenager's refusal to stay silent. Meanwhile, Bridget Monroe faced her own reckoning. Human Resources presented her with options: an unpaid leave to complete a bias awareness and customer empathy program, after which she could apply for reinstatement, or immediate termination. She chose the leave, determined to confront her behavior and regain her dignity. It was painful, but necessary. In the days that followed, social media continued its relentless churn. A hashtag #SitWithRespect trended, encouraging passengers to share stories of speaking up against prejudice. Videos of Flight 672 were reposted thousands of times. Articles under headlines like "Teen Dignity Halts Flight and Racial Profiling in First Class" analyzed the incident from every angle. Evan found himself at the center of a national conversation about courtesy and justice on airline. But he did not crave the spotlight. He declined many interviews, choosing instead to focus on the activism spark ignited by his experience. With his father's support, he founded the Walker Foundation for Respect, offering scholarships to students who had experienced discrimination and workshops on bystander intervention. He spoke at schools, urging peers not to look away when they saw injustice. At one assembly, he said, "We learn in history class that big moments change the world. But big moments often start with small ones, like choosing not to look the other way. When your silence becomes consent, you lose part of your humanity. Today you can choose to speak up." He watched as faces in the audience brightened with understanding. That was the true legacy of Flight 672. Meanwhile, in her training sessions, Bridget met with diversity experts and passenger panels. She studied stories of people who had been humiliated and worked on her own biases through journaling and role play. She learned that uniforms do not grant authority to judge, empathy does. She cried as she wrote in her journal about that moment when she saw Evan and assumed he did not belong. She vowed never to let pride interfere with her service again. When she returned to duty months later, she was a changed woman. At an orientation for new hires, she shared her story without mentioning names. "I once judged a passenger by his appearance, and my mistake cost me my career. If you think you are immune to prejudice, think again." It is easy to spot trouble when you want to, but much harder to, by default, grant everyone the respect you wish for yourself. She watched as trainees nodded solemnly, absorbing her lesson. Evan's foundation grew steadily. Scholarship winners sent thank you letters describing their own encounters with bias and their dreams for the future. Airlines invited him to speak at industry conferences about cultivating respect on board. He reminded executives that a single act of kindness can echo through a lifetime. One afternoon, over coffee, Evan's grandmother, a 65-year-old retired teacher, said, "I wish I had the courage to speak up like that when I was younger." He took her hand. "You can still speak up today, Grandma. Kindness and dignity are timeless." As the years passed, Flight 672 became a case study in school textbooks under chapters titled Courage in Everyday Life. Airlines worldwide adopted the Walker Foundation's training materials, and whenever a passenger heard a discourteous remark in the cabin, they remembered the quiet teenager in a hoodie who refused to be invisible. Evan Walker carried that legacy with him wherever he went. Whether he was flying, attending college lectures, or dining in a neighborhood cafe, he never forgot how it felt to be judged by his appearance and how redemption came through dignity rather than anger. He learned that the most satisfying revenge is not in payback, but in transforming pain into progress. For a woman of 65 reading this story, it may echo moments from your own life. Times you were overlooked, times you felt too shy to speak up, times you wished someone would see you. Let this be your reminder that respect belongs to every person, at every age. Let Evan's quiet power inspire you to find your voice, because even when the cabin lights dim and the world seems hushed, truth still finds a way to speak, and it is the brave who listen, and the brave who act. Evan felt the subtle shift in the cabin atmosphere as the soft overhead lights glowed dully against the pale gray walls. Even though dozens of passengers sat with their eyes closed, headphones playing music so low it was almost silent, he knew their minds were turning in circles around what had happened before takeoff. He watched a young woman lean over to her companion, as though sharing a private thought about the earlier confrontation. He heard the faint click of tray tables folding up, and the scrape of feet shuffling to stretch cramped legs. Every movement carried the weight of that moment when Bridget, the senior flight attendant, had judged him by his hoodie and slapped his hand. Evan stopped pretending to read. His book lay closed on his lap. His phone rested untouched beside a glass of melted ice and half-drunk soda. He simply watched. He watched the way passengers sat straighter when he shifted in his seat. He watched the way they averted their eyes, as though not quite certain how to look at the teenager who had refused to be invisible. He watched how the cabin that had once been just another part of his journey had become a stage for a quiet reckoning. In seat 3C, a woman in a white blazer leaned around her aisle armrest. Her voice was low and careful when she spoke. "Can I say something?" she asked. Evan turned toward her, his posture calm but alert. "You just did," he replied gently. The woman gave a small smile and nodded, gathering her courage. "I've been watching," she said. "Not in a creepy way," she added quickly, "but in a reflective way. You handled that situation with more grace than I've ever seen in a grown adult." Evan waited, silent. "I didn't stand up either," she continued. "I heard everything. I saw her face when she spoke to you. I saw yours too, and then I just sat there because I told myself it wasn't my place. But it was. It always is." He offered her a soft nod, acknowledging her words. "Silence protects the one who is loudest," the woman said, almost to herself. "I won't be silent again." That quiet admission hung in the aisle like a single precious note. It was not a grand apology, it was an honest confession, and it was all Evan had asked for. A few rows back, a businessman in a navy tie opened his laptop, not to check stocks or scan contracts this time, but to type a LinkedIn post. "Today I watched a young man stand taller than anyone on this plane," he wrote. He never raised his voice. "I saw bias, I saw silence, I saw consequence. But above all, I saw control, dignity, and quiet power. That kind of leadership cannot be taught in boardrooms. It is lived." Across the cabin, Taylor, one of the junior flight attendants, finished entering inventory notes in her tablet, but instead of the usual routine entries, she paused at the new section she had added, Incident Summary. Passenger in seat 2A was publicly removed from first class without proper verification of boarding credentials. The crew member responsible failed to follow identification procedures, used dismissive language, and escalated the encounter with physical contact. Passenger remained calm and compliant throughout. Incident resulted in immediate removal of crew member from flight by executive order. Recommend full investigation and review of internal training protocols. She signed her name and slid the tablet into its charging dock. The act of documenting the injustice felt like a balm to her conscience. It was a small step, but at least it was one. Evan looked down at his hands. They were still, resting lightly on his lap. No clenched fists, no nervous tapping. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew exactly what had been done to him. He had watched Bridget's arrogance, seen her dismiss him with a sharp assumption, and felt the sting of her slap against his palm. But he also knew that the true damage lay in the way no one had stopped her. No one had asked to see her manager's list of upgrades. No one had demanded she follow protocol. And it was that silence that he intended to punish. He closed his eyes for a moment. A final message from his father buzzed on his phone. Statement goes live at the gate in 20 minutes. You will be asked if you want to speak publicly. You do not have to, but if you do, I will stand beside you. No pressure. Evan stared at the screen, then he typed, "Let's talk." But he added, "I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about everyone who's ever been told to move quietly to the back. I just happened to have a seat they could not ignore." Morning light crept through the narrow windows, painting long silver stripes down the aisles. Dawn was coming, and so was landing. But the end of the flight would not be the end of the story. The tension that had settled like fog in the cabin refused to lift. The seatbelt sign clicked off, inviting passengers to move, yet many remained seated, as though still caught in the aftermath of what they had witnessed. A mother 2 rows ahead knelt beside her 10-year-old daughter as the little girl shuffled to close her eyes properly. Mom whispered, "Sometimes people treat others badly because of how they look, and when no one speaks up it gets worse. But that boy over there, he refused to stay silent." The girl squeezed her mother's hand, her eyes wide as she turned to look at Evan. He caught her gaze and gave a gentle nod, the kind you give when someone needs to know that they are allowed to see the truth. Back at the front, Taylor smoothed her uniform sleeve as she prepared for landing. Yet her mind remained with Bridget's empty spot. She had worked more than 60 flights this year, but she knew this one would stay with her forever. The truth they had all been forced to face would not fade. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be descending shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and personal items are secure." The sound of clicks and whirs echoed through the cabin as passengers complied. The plane's nose dipped gently, cutting through the morning haze. The engines thrummed deeper, the pressure shifting in their ears. Evan fastened his belt without looking around. His body knew the routine by heart, but his mind reached forward, anticipating the scene at the gate. He did not crave cameras or public statements. He did not want a parade. All he wanted was the truth themselves to follow through. To land with him, to remain grounded, to stain the walls of policy offices with the memory of what they had almost erased. Outside the window, runway lights blurred into streaks of white and amber. The plane's wheels touched down with a calm thud, then slowed with the hiss of brakes and the whine of reversing thrusters. A few passengers clapped automatically, but the sound felt hollow. Applause for a safe landing felt misplaced after a flight defined by moral turbulence. Evan unbuckled and stood, gathering his bag with deliberate slowness. He watched as the woman in white typed notes on her notepad app, as the young man in the business suit closed his laptop with a satisfied click, as Taylor approached to prepare the cabin for arrival. Every movement around him carried the echo of what had begun here, a demand to sit in dignity, a refusal to be erased. The overhead bins opened with a soft sigh, and passengers retrieved their belongings with measured care. The aisle filled, not with the usual impatient rush, but with a sense of purpose. As they stepped past Evan, some offered nods of apology, others murmured thanks. He did not respond. It was enough that they acknowledged their inaction. A ground staff member in a bright safety vest waited at the door. Next to him stood a small team of airline representatives and a handful of media personnel, cameras already poised. But Evan did not move toward them. Instead, he stood back straight as the last passenger shuffled out of the cabin. He remained until the aisle emptied fully, as though reminding them that his presence had a weight they could not simply log away. One by one, the seats emptied until only Evan remained, standing alone at the front of the cabin. The chatter and rustle of departure preparations faded, replaced by an echoing silence. In that quiet, he felt the hush of accountability close in. He exhaled, the breath sounding louder than any clap. Then and only then did he step off the plane, leaving behind the empty rows and the memory of a flight that refused to be ordinary. At the threshold, the early sun glinted off the tarmac. He paused, letting the heat wash over him, and felt the world hold its breath. His father was waiting just beyond the door, eyes proud and steady. William Walker put out his arm, guiding Evan forward. Together, they walked down the jet bridge, not as celebrity and son, but simply as two people who had faced the truth and refused to look away. Behind them, the door closed with a soft click, sealing the cabin in silence once more. But the story they had written in those minutes would not be confined. It would echo in boardrooms, in training rooms, in homes and schools, wherever people needed a reminder that respect is not granted by rank or uniform. It is claimed by every person, every time someone says, "Enough." And for that quiet moment of resistance, that refusal to be unseen, every passenger would carry a piece of that flight with them. Not as a footnote, but as a marker. A reminder that dignity belongs to everyone who dares to sit in the seat they earned and to speak even when the world insists on their silence. Evan sat alone in seat 2A long after the last passenger had stepped into the jet bridge. The cabin lights glowed softly, and the hum of the engines was a distant whisper now. No one else was there to break the silence, yet somehow it did not feel empty or awkward. It felt purposeful. Every second that Evan remained in that seat spoke volumes. It was as if he was saying, "I will not rush away. I have done nothing wrong. I have nothing to hide." Taylor stood a few feet down the aisle near the cockpit door, her hands clasped behind her back. She had not moved since the cabin emptied. In those hours since boarding, she had gone from routine efficiency to awakened witness. She had watched Evan's dignity under fire. She had felt the cold flush of shame for every moment she had once looked away. Now, as she watched him sit upright and calm, her throat tightened with respect. Evan looked up and caught her gaze. He offered the smallest nod. Taylor returned it, and in that brief exchange she understood what it meant to be part of a crew. Not just to hand out snacks or check seatbelts, but to stand for what is right. At that moment, there was nothing left to say. A soft hiss announced the opening of the jet bridge door. 3 people entered the cabin. A tall man in a black overcoat, a younger woman with a clipboard, and a third in a gray suit with a badge pinned to his lapel. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though stepping into a place they did not own. The man in the overcoat approached first. He paused a respectful distance from Evan before speaking. "My name is Grant. I'm with public relations." He let those words hang in the still air for a beat, then continued. "First, let me say there is no excuse for what happened on this flight." Evan did not respond immediately. His calm composure forced Grant to choose his next words carefully. "The flight attendant involved has been removed from duty indefinitely. We have launched an internal review, and we will release a formal apology to the public this afternoon." The woman with the clipboard added, "We understand if you choose not to speak publicly, but if you do, we will support whatever message you want to send." Evan studied their faces. He recognized the polished sincerity in their eyes, but he also saw the careful distance of crisis managers. They were managing reputations, not sitting in his seat. Finally, he spoke in a steady, even voice. "I'm not interested in being a headline. Grant looked ready to jump in, but Evan held up a hand. "But I do want something changed," he said. "Not just a public statement or one person removed. I want every employee who wears your uniform to understand what it means when someone like me is told I do not belong. I want the training you promised to be more than a box they check. I want you to say every passenger who watched this happen and said nothing, because silence was the loudest part of this flight." No one moved or spoke. Then Evan rose. He slung his backpack over one shoulder, the leather strap creaking softly. He glanced around the empty cabin one last time, as though seeing it all for the first time. "This was never just about me," he said, quiet but clear. "It was about everyone who has ever been sent to the back of something they had earned without anyone asking for their ticket. I just happened to have a seat people could not ignore." Grant swallowed, his eyes meeting Evan's. "We hear you," he said. Evan gave a single nod and stepped past them. Taylor moved aside, her eyes following him as he walked down the aisle. He paused at her station and said only this: "You did not say much, but you saw it. And that matters." Then he walked off the plane into the bright corridor beyond the door, into the morning light that awaited. No cameras, no applause, just the quiet weight of a story that would live far beyond a seat number or a boarding pass. Inside the plane, the silence settled again, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with everything that had been said, everything that had been shown, and everything that would never be forgotten. Because some flights carry more than passengers. They carry moments that change hearts and policies, souls and systems. And some travelers, once unseen and unheard, never go unnoticed again. For a woman of 65 reading this story, imagine the times you have waited quietly, told yourself it was not your place to speak up, the moments you felt unseen. Let this be your reminder that silence is consent, and dignity belongs to every person in every seat. If you see injustice, small or large, say something. Because sometimes the quietest witness can spark the loudest change.